The morning air was cool and quiet in Oakwood Heights. Most people were still asleep in their big houses with perfectly trimmed lawns. The neighborhood was known for being safe and expensive, the kind of place where people moved when they made it. Anthony had made it. After years of night shifts and long hours, he had finally saved enough money to buy a house in this neighborhood. As a doctor who worked in the emergency room, he saved lives every day. But today, like most days this week, he was just tired. He pulled into his driveway at 5:30 in the morning. His car headlights cut through the early darkness, illuminating the house he still couldn't believe was his. 3 bedrooms, a backyard, and neighbors who probably didn't have to worry about gunshots or sirens all night. It was everything he had worked for. Anthony didn't go inside right away. After 12 hours of bright hospital lights, beeping machines, and the constant rush of emergencies, he needed some fresh air to clear his head. He grabbed his backpack with his medical journals and locked his car. A walk around the block would help him wind down before sleep. The streets were empty and peaceful. Anthony breathed deeply, letting the tension of the night shift fade away. He had treated 2 car crash victims, a child with severe asthma and an elderly man having a heart attack. All of them would live, thanks to his team's quick work. These were the thoughts that helped him sleep well, despite the odd hours. He didn't notice the woman watching him from behind her curtains. Linda had lived in Oakwood Heights for 15 years. She ran the neighborhood Facebook group and considered herself the unofficial guardian of the community. She woke up early every morning to have coffee on her porch and check her security cameras. Nothing happened in this neighborhood without Linda knowing about it. For the 3rd morning in a row, she spotted the same man walking slowly past homes, stopping occasionally to look around. He wore a dark jacket and carried a backpack. More suspicious was the fact that he was black in a neighborhood that, though Linda would never say it out loud, had very few black residents. "There he is again," she muttered to herself, setting down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. What is he looking for? Linda didn't consider herself prejudiced. She would tell anyone who asked that she didn't see color. But something about this man made her uncomfortable. He didn't look like he belonged in Oakwood Heights. Not in his casual clothes, not at this hour, and not with the way he was studying each house as he passed. He's casing the neighborhood, she decided, reaching for her phone. The neighborhood had been hit with a few car break-ins last summer, and the culprits had never been caught. The community Facebook group had been buzzing about crime in nearby areas for weeks. Linda wasn't going to let Oakwood Heights be next. She watched the man stop near the Johnsons' house. They were away on vacation in Florida. That was enough for her. She dialed 911, her fingers tapping impatiently as she waited for someone to answer. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "Yes, hello," Linda said, her voice hushed but urgent. "I need to report a suspicious person in Oakwood Heights. There's a black man walking around looking at houses. He's been here 3 mornings in a row, and I think he's planning something. He has a backpack and keeps stopping to look at homes." "Can you describe what he's wearing?" the dispatcher asked. "Dark jacket, jeans, and he's carrying a backpack. He's on Pine Street right now," Linda said, watching the man through her blinds. "Please send someone quickly. We're a safe neighborhood, and I don't recognize this person at all." "We'll send officers to check it out," the dispatcher assured her. Linda hung up, feeling satisfied. Better safe than sorry, she thought. She had no idea that her call was about to change everything, not just for the man outside, but for the entire neighborhood, including herself. Linda peeked through her blinds, watching as Anthony continued his peaceful morning walk. She felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that police were on their way. In her mind, she was protecting her community, doing what any responsible neighbor would do. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband, who was away on a business trip. "How's everything at home?" he asked. "Fine, just handling some neighborhood security issues," she replied, not mentioning the call she'd just made. Deep down, a tiny voice questioned if she'd overreacted, but she pushed the thought away. Meanwhile, Anthony was lost in his own thoughts. The weight of his hospital shift still hung on his shoulders. He'd nearly lost a young patient that night, a teenager who came in after a bad car accident. The boy had pulled through, but it had been close. Too close. These were the cases that followed Anthony home, that make him question if he could have done something differently, faster, better. The cool morning air helped clear his mind. He noticed a robin building a nest in one of the maple trees and stopped to watch for a moment. He'd never had time to notice birds in his old apartment near the hospital. This was why he'd moved here, for moments of peace like this. Anthony checked his watch. Almost 6:15 a.m. He should head home and get some sleep before his next shift. As he turned toward his house, he noticed movement at the end of the street. 2 police cars turned onto Pine Street, their lights flashing but sirens off. In the quiet morning, they seemed impossibly loud and out of place. Anthony watched with mild curiosity, wondering what was happening in this supposedly peaceful neighborhood. His curiosity turned to confusion when both cars slowed down near him, then to disbelief when they stopped completely, and finally to a sickening understanding when both car doors opened and officers stepped out with hands hovering near their weapons. "Sir, I need you to stop where you are," called the first officer, a tall man with a crew cut. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Anthony froze, his medical bag suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds on his shoulder. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm, a skill learned through years of handling emergencies. He slowly raised his hands, palms forward. "What's going on, officers?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his body. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area," said the second officer, a younger woman with her hair pulled back tightly. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Anthony took a careful breath before answering. "I live here. I just finished a night shift at the hospital and was taking a walk before heading home to sleep." "You live in this neighborhood?" the male officer asked, his doubt barely concealed. "Yes, at 287 Pine Street. I moved in 2 weeks ago," Anthony replied. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Linda watched the scene unfold from her window. A strange mix of emotions washed over her, satisfaction that the police had responded so quickly, but also a creeping uneasiness at how they were approaching the man. She hadn't expected them to treat him like he was dangerous. "I'm going to need to see some ID," the female officer said, taking a step closer to Anthony. "My wallet is in my back pocket," Anthony said carefully. "I'm going to reach for it very slowly." The male officer nodded, his hand still near his weapon, very slowly. Anthony's fingers trembled slightly as he reached back for his wallet. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped for simply existing in a space where people didn't expect to see someone who looked like him. But it was the first time it had happened in what was supposed to be his own neighborhood, the place he'd worked so hard to call home. From her window, Linda's uneasiness grew as she watched the officer's tense postures. This wasn't what she had expected. She had called about a suspicious person, but now, seeing the man's careful, respectful movements and the fear hidden behind his composed face, doubt began to creep in. And then he pulled out not just a driver's license, but what looked like some kind of professional ID card. Linda leaned closer to her window, a knot forming in her stomach. What had she just set in motion? Anthony's hand trembled slightly as he held out his wallet. The morning birds continued their cheerful songs, oblivious to the tension filling the air. The female officer took the wallet, her eyes never leaving Anthony's face as she flipped it open. "Dr. Anthony Wilson," she read aloud, glancing at the driver's license. Her eyebrows rose slightly when she saw the address. 287 Pine Street. That's in this neighborhood. The male officer shifted his weight, his hand moving slightly away from his weapon. "You said you work at a hospital?" "Yes," Anthony replied, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "I'm an emergency room doctor at City Memorial. I just finished a 12-hour night shift." He gestured carefully toward his bag. "I have my hospital ID in the front pocket of my bag. May I show you?" The female officer nodded, though her partner kept his watchful stance. Anthony slowly unzipped his bag and pulled out a badge with his photo, name, and emergency medicine, attending physician clearly printed on it. The officers exchanged glances. The atmosphere shifted subtly. "So you just moved here?" the female officer asked, her tone slightly less stern. 2 weeks ago, Anthony confirmed. "I usually take a walk after my night shifts to clear my head before sleeping. It helps me process everything I've seen at the hospital." From her window, Linda watched the conversation. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the change in the officer's posture. The confrontational energy was dissolving into something else. The knot in her stomach tightened. "What kind of doctor did you say you were again?" the male officer asked, his voice now curious rather than suspicious. "Emergency medicine," Anthony replied. "I treat everything from heart attacks to car accidents to broken bones." The male officer's face changed. "Wait, at City Memorial. Were you working last weekend, Saturday night?" Anthony thought for a moment. "Yes, I was on from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The officer's expression softened completely. "I think you treated my nephew, Tyler Harris. He came in with a baseball injury, got hit in the face with a ball during a night game." Recognition dawned on Anthony's face. "The college sophomore with the orbital fracture. Yes, I remember him. He was worried about missing his exams." "That's him," the officer said, now smiling slightly. "He said the doctor who treated him was really good, took extra time to explain everything, and even called his professor to arrange for him to take his test later. I try to help my patients with the whole picture, not just the immediate injury," Anthony explained, his shoulders finally relaxing a bit. "How is he doing?" "Much better, thanks to you." The female officer handed back Anthony's wallet and ID. "I apologize for the confusion, Dr. Wilson. We received a call about someone suspicious in the neighborhood." Anthony nodded, a familiar heaviness settling in his chest. "I understand. You were just responding to the call." The male officer looked uncomfortable. "Someone reported a suspicious person looking at houses. Given that you live here and were just taking a walk." "I can guess who called," Anthony said quietly. Across the street, Linda had opened her front door and was now standing on her porch, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. The female officer noticed her and said something to her partner. They both looked in Linda's direction. "Is that your house?" the female officer asked Anthony, pointing to 287 Pine Street. "Yes, that's mine," he confirmed. "We'll walk you home," the male officer offered, a gesture that was part apology, part protection. As they walked toward Anthony's house, neighbors began to appear on porches and in windows, drawn by the unusual sight of police cars on their quiet street. Anthony felt their stares like physical touches on his skin. This wasn't how he had planned to meet his new neighbors. The officers flanked him as they walked up the driveway to his house. Anthony fished his keys from his pocket, acutely aware of the audience they now had. The beautiful home he had been so proud to purchase now felt like a stage where he was performing his right to belong. The female officer turned to face Linda, who was now making her way across the street, curiosity and dread babbling on her face. "Ma'am, did you call about a suspicious person in the neighborhood?" the officer asked. Linda nodded, her eyes darting between the officer and Anthony. Yes, I did." The male officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'd like to introduce you to your neighbor, Dr. Anthony Wilson. He just moved in 2 weeks ago." Anthony stood tall, keys in hand, facing the woman who had seen him as a threat rather than a neighbor. The next few moments would change everything. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across Anthony's front yard. The dew on the grass sparkled, creating a beautiful scene that sharply contrasted with the tension in the air. Linda stood frozen at the edge of Anthony's property, her face a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness. "Dr. Wilson works at City Memorial Hospital in the emergency room," the female officer explained, her tone professional but pointed. "He was taking a walk after his night shift when you called us." Linda's cheeks flushed red. "How was I supposed to know that? I've never seen him before." Anthony took a deep breath. He'd been in this situation before, being asked to justify his presence in spaces where people like him weren't expected. Usually he would stay calm, explain himself, and move on. But this was different. This was his home. "You could have introduced yourself," he said quietly. "I've been walking in the neighborhood for the past week. I've waved to you twice." Linda looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I was just being careful. We've had break-ins before." More neighbors had gathered now, watching from a distance. An older man in a bathrobe approached, concern written on his face. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the police officers and Anthony. The male officer explained the situation briefly. It was a misunderstanding. Dr. Wilson here is a new neighbor who was taking a walk after his hospital shift. The older man's eyes widened. You're the new owner of the Henderson place? I'm Robert. I live next door. He extended his hand to Anthony. We've been wondering when we'd meet you. Anthony shook Robert's hand, grateful for the simple human gesture. Nice to meet you, though I wish it had been under better circumstances. Robert glanced at Linda, then back at Anthony. I'm sorry about this. This isn't how we usually welcome people to Oakwood Heights. Another neighbor stepped forward, a woman in jogging clothes. You work at City Memorial. My daughter had her baby there last month. The ER staff was amazing when we went in thinking she was in early labor. Anthony smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his body. That's great to hear. We have an excellent obstetrics team. The female officer touched her partner's arm, signaling it was time for them to leave. Dr. Wilson again, we apologize for the confusion. Enjoy your new home. As the officers headed back to their cars, Linda remained rooted to her spot, watching as her neighbors gathered around Anthony, introducing themselves, asking questions about his work, and offering belated welcomes. You must be exhausted after your shift, Robert said. We should let you get some rest. Anthony nodded gratefully. It's been a long night. The small crowd began to disperse, but not before several neighbors invited Anthony to the community barbecue that weekend. As they walked away, Linda finally found her courage and approached him. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You thought I didn't belong here, Anthony finished for her. There was no anger in his voice, just a weary acknowledgement. Linda looked down at her hands. I've lived here for 15 years. I know everyone. When I saw someone I didn't recognize looking at houses. You assumed the worst, Anthony said, because of how I look. Linda wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't about race, that she would have called about anyone suspicious. But standing there, facing the man she had reported, she couldn't bring herself to say the words. Deep down, she knew the truth. I made a mistake, she admitted finally. Anthony studied her face. He'd seen this before, the moment when someone realized their own bias. It wasn't his job to make her feel better about it, but he also knew that growth came from uncomfortable moments like this. I work at the hospital saving lives, he said. People like you, people like me, anyone who comes through those doors. I don't ask what neighborhood they live in or what they look like. I just help them. Linda nodded, tears forming in her eyes. I bought this house because I wanted a peaceful place to come home to after seeing trauma all night, Anthony continued. All I want is to be a neighbor, just like everyone else. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Linda wiped a tear from her cheek, the full impact of what she had done finally hitting her. What can I do, she asked finally, to make this right? Anthony looked at Linda's tear-streaked face. Her question hung in the air between them. What can I do to make this right? He was tired, bone-deep tired from his shift, from the confrontation with police, from having to yet again prove he belonged somewhere. I don't have an answer for you right now, he said honestly. I just want to get some sleep. Linda nodded, wiping her eyes. Of course. I'm sorry. She turned to leave, her shoulders slumped. Linda, Anthony called after her. She turned back. This isn't something that gets fixed with one conversation. It's going to take time. She nodded again and walked slowly back to her house. Anthony watched her go, then went inside, locked his door, and finally let his guard down. His hands shook as he set his bag down. The adrenaline that had kept him composed during the confrontation was wearing off, leaving him drained. He sent a quick text to his sister. Had the police called on me for walking in my new neighborhood? I'm okay. Tell you more later. Then he fell into bed, too exhausted to even change his clothes. When Anthony woke up, the sun was already setting. He'd slept all day. His phone showed several missed calls from his sister and a text from Robert, his next-door neighbor. Hope you're okay. The neighborhood is talking. Many of us want to make this right. Anthony sighed and got up to make coffee. As the coffee brewed, he looked out his kitchen window. He could see into Linda's backyard, where she sat alone on her patio, staring into space, a forgotten book in her lap. The doorbell rang, startling him. Through the peephole, he saw Robert standing there with a casserole dish. Anthony opened the door. I hope I'm not bothering you, Robert said. My wife made her famous lasagna. Thought you might be hungry after everything. Anthony accepted the dish. Thanks, that's really kind. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Look, I want to apologize for what happened this morning. That's not who we are as a community. Isn't it though? Anthony asked quietly. It happened here. Robert looked pained. Some of us are having a meeting tonight at my house. About what happened. About making sure it doesn't happen again. Would you come? Only if you feel up to it, of course. Anthony hesitated. The easy thing would be to say no, to keep to himself, to build walls between himself and these neighbors. But that wouldn't change anything. What time? He asked. An hour later, Anthony walked into Robert's living room and found 12 neighbors sitting in a circle. Linda was there too, sitting slightly apart from the others, looking nervous. The conversation stopped when he entered. Dr. Wilson, a woman said, standing up. I'm Diane, head of the Neighborhood Association. Thank you for coming. Anthony nodded and took the empty seat offered to him. The room felt tense. We've been talking about what happened this morning, Diane continued, and about some uncomfortable truths about our neighborhood. Robert spoke up. Out of the 64 houses in Oakwood Heights, yours is the first owned by a black family. That's not right. Another neighbor, an elderly man, cleared his throat. When we moved here 30 years ago, there were rules about who could buy houses here. Not official rules, mind you, but real estate agents knew. Things have changed legally, but the patterns remained. Anthony listened as they talked openly about the neighborhood's history, about hidden biases, about good intentions that weren't enough. No one made excuses. No one tried to rush to solutions. Finally, Linda spoke. Her voice was shaky but determined. I spent all day thinking about why I called the police. I told myself it was about safety, but I need to be honest. If you had been white, I wouldn't have called. I would have just assumed you belonged here. The room went quiet. Her honesty hung in the air. What happened this morning wasn't just about one call or one mistake, Anthony said, breaking the silence. It's about who feels safe where, who has to justify their presence, who gets the benefit of the doubt. So what do we do? Asked a younger neighbor. How do we change things? Anthony looked around the room at these people who had gathered not to make excuses but to listen and learn. We start by having uncomfortable conversations, he said, like this one. And then we keep having them. 2 weeks had passed since the neighborhood meeting at Robert's house. The early summer air was warm as Anthony pulled into his driveway after another long shift at the hospital. This time, though, something was different. A small basket sat on his front porch. He approached it cautiously, then smiled when he saw the note attached. Thought you might need this after your shift. Your neighbors. Inside were homemade muffins, fresh fruit, and a gift card to the local coffee shop. This wasn't the first such gesture. Nearly every day since the incident, Anthony had found small signs of welcome, flowers planted along his walkway, invitations to dinner, offers to mow his lawn while he worked his long shifts. The community was trying. But what touched Anthony most was how they were doing more than just being nice to him. They were actually changing. After the meeting at Robert's house, the Neighborhood Association had formed a community inclusion committee. They started by examining why Oakwood Heights had remained so homogeneous for so long. What they discovered wasn't flattering, subtle steering by real estate agents, unwelcoming attitudes, and assumptions about who belonged had all played a part. The doorbell rang as Anthony was putting the basket on his kitchen counter. He opened the door to find Diane, the Neighborhood Association president. Sorry to bother you, she said. I know you probably just got home from work. It's fine, Anthony assured her. What's up? The committee wanted me to run something by you, Diane explained. We're thinking of hosting a community health fair next month. Free basic screenings, health information, that sort of thing. We'd open it up to surrounding neighborhoods too, not just Oakwood Heights. Anthony raised his eyebrows. That's a great idea. We were hoping you might help us plan it, Diane continued. And maybe some of your hospital colleagues would volunteer. We'd cover all the supplies and everything. Anthony nodded slowly. I think I could help with that. The hospital has an outreach program that might partner with us. Diane beamed. That would be wonderful. Oh, and Linda wanted me to give you this. She handed Anthony an envelope. I'll let you get some rest. Call me when you're ready to talk about the health fair." After Diane left, Anthony opened the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to a lunch at Linda's house, scheduled for his next day off. There was also a handwritten note. "I've been doing a lot of thinking and learning. I know one lunch won't fix what happened, but I'd like to talk to you properly. No pressure. Linda." Anthony set the invitation on his coffee table. He wasn't sure how he felt about having lunch with Linda. Their interactions since the incident had been brief and polite, but he kept his distance. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "How's life in the fancy neighborhood?" Anthony typed back, "Getting better, actually. The neighbors are trying." His sister replied, "Trying or trying?" The question made Anthony smile. His sister had always been skeptical about his move to Oakwood Heights. "Actually trying," he wrote back, "making real changes." He set his phone down and looked out the window. Across the street, Linda was in her garden, planting something new. Next door, Robert was chatting with another neighbor, both of them glancing occasionally at Anthony's house. For the first time since moving in, Anthony felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of community. Not the superficial kind where people smiled but kept their distance, but something more meaningful. These people had faced an uncomfortable truth about themselves and had chosen to grow rather than retreat. Anthony picked up Linda's invitation again. Having lunch with her wouldn't erase what happened, but maybe it was a step worth taking. He was interrupted by another text from his sister. "Just be careful. People don't change overnight." Anthony knew she was right. This wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. The work of building a truly inclusive community would take much longer than 2 weeks. There would be missteps, awkward moments, and more difficult conversations ahead. But as he watched his neighbors going about their evening, now waving when they saw him at the window, he felt cautiously hopeful. Sometimes it took a painful moment of truth to create the possibility for real change. He texted his sister back, "I know, but they're trying. And so am I." 6 months had passed since that morning when Linda called the police on Anthony. The leaves had changed colors and fallen, and the first light snow of winter dusted the rooftops of Oakwood Heights. Anthony pulled into the parking lot of the community center, amazed at how full it was. Today was the third community health fair, and word had spread far beyond their neighborhood. What had started as a small event in the summer had grown into something much bigger. Inside, the gym was transformed into a bustling health clinic. Nurses took blood pressure readings at one station. Dental students offered free screenings at another. Hospital staff gave out information on everything from diabetes prevention to mental health resources. Anthony spotted Linda at the welcome table, checking people in and directing them to the right stations. She looked up and waved when she saw him. "We've already had 87 people come through this morning," she told him proudly. That family from Pine Ridge Apartments brought their whole extended family. Anthony nodded, remembering how Linda had once been nervous about outsiders coming into Oakwood Heights. Now she knew most of them by name. "Is the pediatrician here yet?" he asked. "We've got a lot of kids today." "Dr. Chen just arrived," Linda said. "She's setting up in the corner with the colorful banners." Anthony made his way through the crowd, stopping often to chat with people he now considered friends. Robert and his wife were helping an elderly man fill out paperwork. Diane was translating for a Spanish-speaking family. Even the police officers who had confronted Anthony that morning were there. Officer Rivera was demonstrating CPR on a dummy while his partner handed out safety information. It was hard to believe how much had changed in 6 months. The lunch with Linda had been a turning point. Instead of making excuses, she had listened to Anthony's experiences. They talked for hours that day about growing up in different worlds, about assumptions and fears, about what it meant to truly be neighbors. That conversation led to others. Anthony started joining the neighborhood association meetings. When he spoke, people actually listened. His suggestion to use the annual block party budget for a community health fair instead had been met with enthusiasm rather than resistance. The first health fair had been small, just a few tables in the park. But when over 50 people from surrounding neighborhoods showed up, everyone realized they had tapped into a real need. Now they held one every 2 months, and medical professionals from across the city volunteered their time. "Dr. Wilson," a voice called out. Anthony turned to see a young man approaching with his mother. "Remember me?" Anthony smiled in recognition. "Tyler, right? Officer Rivera's nephew, the baseball injury." "Yes, sir," Tyler said, beaming. "I'm in nursing school now. Your ER team inspired me." "He's volunteering today," his mother added proudly. "Wanted to give back." Anthony felt a warm sense of satisfaction as he watched Tyler head over to the first aid station. One moment of kindness in the ER had rippled outward in ways he couldn't have predicted. Later, as the day wound down and volunteers began cleaning up, Linda sat down beside Anthony in the now quiet gym. "I've been thinking about that morning," she said. "If I hadn't called the police, none of this might have happened," Anthony finished for her. Linda nodded. "It's strange how something so wrong led to something good, but I still wish I hadn't done it." "I wish you hadn't too," Anthony said honestly, "but I'm glad we didn't waste the opportunity to learn from it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Their friendship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when Linda said the wrong thing or when Anthony felt the need to guard himself. But there was real respect between them now, built on honesty and a willingness to grow. The spring health fair should focus on children's health, Linda suggested. "My sister's a pediatric nutritionist. She might volunteer." Anthony nodded. "And we should reach out to those apartment complexes on the east side. Many of those families don't have regular health care." As they continued planning, Anthony looked around at the community center that had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over fear. What had begun as one neighbor's suspicion had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined, a bridge between communities that had long been separated by invisible walls. Sometimes, Anthony thought, it takes an uncomfortable truth to create meaningful change.